When you really think about it, the fact that a movie can go from an idea to a full feature-length piece is kind of a miracle. With all of the different people involved across all of the different departments, you would think that the preparation, planning, and actual shooting would have to go flawlessly in order to see the big screen. However, every filming process encounters its fair share of hiccups. When looking at a horror movie's production, a number of factors can disrupt a shooting schedule. With trying to create the right atmosphere via lighting or set design, constantly having to rely on practical effects, and even dealing with emotionally intense scenes, there's a lot of places where things can begin to go wrong. Not to mention creative differences being a whole nother aspect to this. All of these different elements can cause major delays and even fracture relationships between cast and crew. Needless to say, being on a movie set can be a great experience, but there is a flip side to that, and it can be one of the worst. Today I wanted to actually take a look at some horror movie sets that seemed absolutely miserable to work on. And a lot of the movies on this list have already actually had documentaries made about just how bad the whole shooting process actually was. Now let's go ahead and just dive straight into the list and look at the first movie, which is going to be The Exorcist from 1973. The original Exorcist from 1973 is one of the most controversial movies of all time. There are multiple different reasons for this, but it doesn't help that shooting didn't exactly go smoothly and there were a lot of strange occurrences that did happen. After the film released, there were a few deaths from different people who had worked on the movie that seemed kind of unlikely. Some of the people that passed away were still young and died from just common sicknesses. Now looking at what actually happened during shooting, one of the big occurrences was a big set fire that broke out. The part of the set that burned was actually being used as the McNeil family home. For those of you that don't know, the McNeil family is the main family in the movie who has to deal with the possession and then eventual exorcism. The cause of the set fire is actually still unknown, and it torched the entire set. Well, it burned everything except one room. And of course that room was Reagan's room, where the eventual exorcism would actually be taking place at.
I do remember getting a phone call one morning at 4 a.m. from the production manager who said, "Don't bother to come to work today." And I said, "Why, am I fired?" And he said, "No, but the set has just burned to the ground." Interestingly, it was while we were shooting the exorcism scene, because we had to shut down. We shut down for 6 weeks. It was that long to rebuild we had to rebuild the entire set.
After this had been dealt with, unfortunately one of the cast members had learned about a death in his family, and it caused him to travel back home to Sweden for it. Production had already been delayed, but this definitely didn't help. And then not long after that, Linda Blair, the girl who portrays Reagan, learned that her grandfather had passed away, so this caused her to have to leave set as well. Eventually, she was able to come back and start filming, but things didn't go great for her. One of the biggest things to come out of the filming from this was the fact that Linda Blair had actually fractured her lower back while filming a scene where she's convulsing while strapped into a harness. When the harness was attached to her, it was a little looser than it should have been, so it really started to throw her around, causing the fracture to happen. And unfortunately, while filming, her cries of anguish matched what was in the script, so for everyone behind the camera, things seemed to be going fine. This injury did stick with her for life, causing her constant issues, and the clip that they actually used in the movie, I believe, was the take where she hurt her back originally. Although The Exorcist did have its fair share of problems, there is another movie on this list that had a fair share of problems throughout shooting. That being The Shining from 1980. To this day, The Shining is one of the most well-known and referenced horror movies of all time. Just how many times have you seen the "Here's Johnny" scene referenced or referred to in other works?
Here's Danny. Here's Corpsey. Here's Johnny. I am Johnny. Here's Johnny. Here's Spency. Here's Donnie. Yeah!
And although The Shining does have this major reputation of one of the greatest horror movies of all time, the cast and crew really were put through the ringer in order to get it there. It isn't a secret that Stanley Kubrick was an intense and very harsh director to work for, but he demanded excellence. One of the reasons he was so intense to work with is he wanted multiple and I mean multiple takes of everything. The Shining to this day still holds the Guinness Book of World Records for the most amount of takes for a scene with dialogue between two characters. In case you were wondering, that scene involved Danny and Dick Hallorann discussing their unique abilities. Keep in mind, Danny Lloyd, who portrayed Danny Torrance, was 6 years old at the time. Yes, he was 6 years old, and there were 148 takes needed to get the final product. This would be exhausting for anyone, much less a 6-year-old. When researching for this video, apparently that was a huge reason that Danny Lloyd got hired, was because of his attention span at such a young age. Another instance of scenes needing way too many takes was a scene with Philip Stone, who portrayed Delbert Grady, when he's acting with Jack Nicholson. In an interview, he had mentioned the whole scene was supposed to last roughly 8 minutes, and they shot it between 50 and 60 times. And after one of those takes, Philip Stone mentions him and Jack Nicholson sitting down with Kubrick to go over the footage. At one point, Jack Nicholson apparently said, "That was pretty good, wasn't it?" And Kubrick replied with one thing: "Yes, it was. Now let's go again." This won't be the last time I mention the amount of takes needed for a scene in The Shining, but it was things like this that turned a 17-week production into nearly a full year. Unfortunately, even the props weren't safe. In the infamous scene where Jack starts hacking at the bathroom door trying to get through, apparently there were 60 doors used for that. A part of it was Jack Nicholson apparently had training as a firefighter and was breaking through the prop doors too easily, so they did eventually switch from prop doors over to real ones. But even with that being said, they still had to get through 60 doors before Kubrick decided they could move on. Now, it would be impossible to talk about the set conditions on The Shining without mentioning Shelley Duvall. Shelley portrayed Jack's wife Wendy, who arguably had some of the most emotionally intense scenes in the movie. Most of the scenes see Wendy in absolute hysterics. That, combined with the fact that Kubrick was gonna want probably at least 20 takes guaranteed, was very demanding. Shelley Duvall talked about the filming process and how she would get into the mindset to portray Wendy. She mentioned that she would just think about sad memories and honestly just missing home at the time, but it got to a point where after doing this so much every day, her body got to a point where it was starting to almost reject that. Having to constantly be in these dark headspaces and deal with the perfection levels that Kubrick wanted left Shelley Duvall in a state of constant exhaustion while on set. This intense demand left her with constant bouts of illness, along with actually losing hair during shooting. Just based from different interviews I've seen, it seems like Shelley Duvall definitely had it the hardest while on set, and it really does show in the movie. Although it didn't break any Guinness World Records, the scene where Jack is approaching Wendy on the staircase still used 127 takes before they moved on. And if you remember in that scene, she is crying and screaming, so she is having to act with every fiber of her being. And she had to do that 127 times. There were some other issues with people getting lost in the giant hedge maze, but that was on the smaller side of things. Alright, now let's move on from excessive amount of takes and talk about a movie that had a whole different slew of issues, that being Jaws from 1975. Steven Spielberg really went from thinking this was going to be the movie that killed his career to it being one of the most well-known movies of all time. Now let's keep in mind throughout this that this was only Spielberg's second movie directing, so he didn't have the big name that he has today. So just to start, the original production was only meant to last 55 days. That 55 days ended up turning into 159. Now there are many reasons for the delays, but a huge one was the fact that Spielberg opted to shoot in actual open water versus using a tank. Hell, there was even a time where they were considering using actual great white sharks to get this movie done. Just imagine what that 159 days could have turned into. Although using actual sharks would have 100% caused longer delays, the mechanical ones that they opted in to use definitely had their fair share of problems as well. On one of the first days of shooting with the sharks involved, they put it into the water and it immediately sank. And unfortunately for them, this would be far from the last time these mechanical sharks would give them issues. A big cause for a lot of the malfunctions with the sharks lied in how they were actually constructed. When these sharks were being tested in a tank, they seemed to work perfectly fine, but moving them into actual salt water was what was causing all of these different malfunctions. While the sharks were a constant whole mess in themselves, there were other issues on set. For instance, one of the mechanical sharks wasn't the only thing to sink while shooting. A replica of the Orca was built with the intention on sinking it at the end of filming. Unfortunately for the production team, this replica sank before they were able to shoot what they needed to shoot. So that means another one did have to be built. Once the realization really set in with how difficult it was going to be shooting in open water and really how limited the mechanical sharks were, script rewrites were immediately started to try to make it easier to shoot around them. These delays with things sinking and having to constantly be repaired caused actors to have to fill free time. Some of the actors would just hang out, read books, others decided to work out while on set, but not Robert Shaw. For Robert Shaw, he filled a lot of his time with drinking. Unfortunately, his drinking would spill over onto set and he would act in a lot of scenes drunk. The famous monologue on the boat actually had to be completely reshot because the first time they shot it, Robert Shaw was hammered and slurred through the entire thing.
Robert, who is an extraordinary actor, I mean, just extraordinary. But, you know, we all knew he had a little bit of a drinking issue. And he did come to me and ask for my permission to have a few drinks before he shot the scene. And then an hour went by and we had the camera set up, and all of a sudden I saw Robert coming back on the ship, the Orca, from a support boat, and there were two crew members. One had him under one arm, the other had him on the other arm, and he was kind of walking, but he wasn't, his feet really weren't touching the ground. Suffice to say that at about half an hour into that, I sent him back home.
Some other delays obviously were going to be bad weather because they were shooting on open water, the crew getting seasick, and having to find ways to shoot on the open water without having to damage all the gear. Luckily, the cast and crew were able to push through this nightmare and left us with a classic. Now let's move on to a movie that actually came out just the year before this, that being Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974.
After you stop screaming, you'll start talking about it.
The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a movie that has had countless scholarly articles written about it. This dingy, low-budget slasher broke big and ended up becoming one of the most well-known horror series of all time. With that being said, filming certain parts of this movie seemed like hell on earth. Due to the extremely low budget the movie was working with, the shoot days had to be long. This meant they averaged about 16-hour days, 7 days a week in order to limit the amount of time the gear and crew were needed. On top of the extremely long days, the location where it was shot being in Round Rock, Texas, temperatures averaged between 90 to 100 degrees, with them peaking at about 115. In an interview, Gunnar Hansen, who played Leatherface, mentioned just how bad the conditions were. He said since the budget was so low, they didn't actually want to wash his Leatherface costume because they were afraid that the department would either lose it, the costume would change size, or even color, and they didn't have the money for another one. So this big fella was wearing this costume 16 hours a day in 100-degree heat constantly, without being able to wash it. Not saying this specifically about Gunnar Hansen, but you can imagine with those conditions, the set probably didn't smell the greatest. That can really be said when dealing with just the Sawyer family house itself. Being that it was the 70s and they were working on a shoestring budget, a lot of the set deck in that house were just actual dead animal carcasses throughout. So imagine a rotting carcass in 100 degrees, upwards of 120 degrees when you turn on all the production lights and everything. Just imagine how bad that smelled. Speaking of the Sawyer house, we do have to talk about the infamous dinner scene. Although depending on who you ask, the number changes. Apparently they did at one point have a roughly 20 to 24 hour straight shoot day in that house.
It was like a 27-hour shoot.
That proved to be like a 27-hour shooting day.
26 hours, almost 36 hours straight.
Keep in mind, that's almost a full day locked inside of a heat shed, essentially. With the day being so long, it being so hot and smelling so bad, between takes people were running outside for either fresh air or even a puke break. While filming this sequence, there's a particular moment where Leatherface is supposed to cut Sally's finger and then drip the blood into Grandpa's mouth. Unfortunately, the effect they were trying to use just wasn't working properly, and it got Gunnar Hansen very frustrated. Well, Gunnar Hansen decided he was going to make things work. He took Marilyn Burns' hands, who Marilyn Burns played Sally Hardesty in the movie. He took her hand and actually cut it, and then dripped actual blood into John Dugan's mouth, who played Grandpa. In the heat of the moment, no pun intended, no one noticed, and they got the scene done and just moved on. Another moment that would never fly on a set today is a moment between Jim Seedow and then Marilyn Burns as well. They got to a part in the scene where Drayton Sawyer, who's the leader of the family, is supposed to be beating on Sally at the dinner table. In an interview, Seydow mentioned how he actually had a really hard time with the depiction of violence in this movie, and they really just couldn't get a usable take out of him. Apparently, Tobe Hooper, as well as other cast and crew, including Marilyn Burns herself, were encouraging him to just actually hit her. Eventually, he got with everyone and just started wailing on her. Once he started doing this and actually hitting her, it did still take about 8 takes, and he said by the end, Marilyn Burns was just completely out of it.
And he's clubbing you. And he's trying, being the gentleman that he was, trying to be tender with it, and take after take after take. And I understand that you said something to him, like, let's get this over with.
Yeah, well, because Toby said, Jim, you're not hitting the woman. And Jim said, Toby, I just can't hit the woman. And, I mean, we were done so many takes, and he says, Jim, they can tell you're pulling the punches. So I said, hey, Jim, if you don't want to be back here tomorrow night doing this thing all night long, just go ahead and hit me.
The shooting conditions for all of the Texas Chainsaw movies don't seem particularly great, but this one seems awful. Now let's move on to the last and final movie on this list, that being The Island of Dr. Moreau from 1996.
The Island of Dr. Moreau.
When I was researching for this video and saw this movie pop up, I knew I was going to have to talk about it. This is by far one of the most train wreck of a productions I've ever read about. It's not the fact that the issues that occurred on this set were the worst by any means, but just how many there were and how constant they were. The production of The Island of Dr. Moreau could easily have a whole video for itself, and it does already have its own documentary titled The Lost Soul, The Doomed Journey of Richard Stanley's Island of Dr. Moreau. That title should tell you everything you need to know going in. The fact that this movie somehow saw the big screen amazes me to this day. And I guess with that being said, we will actually start with Richard Stanley himself. Stanley was the first director hired for this project and treated it as a true passion project. New Line saw the risk knowing Richard Stanley was a newer director, but they did see the passion he was bringing in with him. Filming for this movie took place in Cairns, Australia, so on top of heat, they unfortunately were also getting hit with some pretty nasty weather at the start of shooting. With problems like weather starting early, it didn't help either that Val Kilmer decided to show up 2 days later than he was supposed to. Once Kilmer finally did arrive, he was just obnoxious and seen as a bully on set. Between the weather and early on-set hostility, Rob Morrow, who was going to portray one of the characters, actually reached out to New Line's chairman Bob Shaye at the time to see if he could be released from this movie. Surprisingly, Bob Shaye did let Rob Morrow out of it, but unfortunately for Richard Stanley, that started to give New Line a hint that things weren't going good. This actually caused New Line to fire Richard Stanley for his inexperience and inability to get his set under control. So just a quick recap, within days of starting to shoot, we've already lost a huge supporting actor and the director. After Stanley was fired, he was actually furious and started ripping up documents while he was still on the set. This caused New Line to come in and tell him if we can get you on a car and fly you back to America, they'd still give him most of his pay if he just went quietly. Well, Richard Stanley heard this and agreed, but on the way to the airport, he disappeared. This actually caused New Line to beef up security around the set because they were worried Richard Stanley would come back to sabotage shooting. This will not be the last time we talk about Richard Stanley, but we'll move on to something else for now. After the news of his firing spread around set, it left actually a lot of the cast and crew very upset. Fairuza Balk, the leading actress, actually stormed off set and had a PA drive her all the way to Sydney from the set, which was roughly 1,500 miles. The only reason she ended up returning was because her agent told her, if you don't, this will most likely ruin the rest of your career. Once everyone was back and things were finally starting to settle down, New Line brought in veteran director John Frankenheimer. Frankenheimer was seen as one of the last old school Hollywood directors, meaning he was going to be strict and harsh, but things were gonna get done. Or at least that's what New Line hoped. One of the big reasons Frankenheimer took this job, like a lot of the other people on the set, was to work with Marlon Brando. On top of working with Brando, he was actually able to leverage the entire situation into getting a bigger payday and a 3-picture deal with New Line. So as far as Frankenheimer was concerned, he definitely got the good end of the stick until Brando arrived. As soon as Marlon Brando arrived on set, he was immediately a pain to deal with. And this wasn't anything new for Marlon Brando, he had always sort of had this reputation, but it just continued onto this set as well. The outfit he actually showed up in ended up being what his character wore mainly in the movie, minus some extra accessories that the costume department gave him. Marlon Brando refused to learn lines and had to have them read to him through an earpiece. To be fair to him, this wasn't the first or last time he would refuse to learn lines and would wear an earpiece on set. And you can actually see the earpiece in multiple different scenes throughout the movie. Ironically, although he didn't want to learn his lines, he read the script enough to get it changed so that Nelson De La Rosa would be included more. For some reason, Marlon Brando really took a liking to De La Rosa and wanted him to be in nearly every scene alongside him. This change to the script is actually what went on to inspire the Mini-Me character in all of the Austin Powers movies. On top of not learning his lines, a lot of days he would just refuse to come out of his trailer and relax in the nice air conditioning. Meanwhile, while he was kicking it up relaxing, there were countless extras in full prosthetics waiting out in the Australian heat. And these prosthetics weren't just little bits added here and there, they were full fur costumes from head to toe. Once Marlon Brando decided to grace everyone with his presence on set, he would usually headbutt with everyone, including Frankenheimer and Val Kilmer. There were plenty of times throughout shooting where Kilmer and Brando would get into arguments, leading in both men retreating to their trailer for hours on end. Apparently in one of these arguments, Brando told Kilmer, "You confused the size of your paycheck with the size of your ability." I think it's safe to say these two definitely did not get along. And keep in mind, all of these things I'm talking about weren't one-off occurrences. These were things that were happening every single day, causing constant delays. For Val Kilmer, a lot of the times, he would just give weird line deliveries and honestly just didn't care to be there. Now, let's rewind a bit. Remember when I said this? This will not be the last time we talk about Richard Stanley. Well, now it's time for Richard Stanley to make his return to this story. It started with him, so it's only fitting that it ends with him. Towards the end of shooting, Richard Stanley had actually started meeting up with some of the cast and crew at a bar outside of set. They eventually formulated a plan to sneak Stanley back onto set towards the end of shooting. The plan for him was to sneak onto set as an extra in a scene where they were going to be burning down a lot of the set. So it really does seem fitting that this would be his return. Their plan ended up working, and they successfully snuck Stanley back onto the set in full costume to shoot the ending. You can actually see Richard Stanley in the background of some of the scenes as well. After everything was done and filming finally wrapped, Richard Stanley actually did attend the after party as well. It's actually said that Val Kilmer saw Stanley at the after party and apologized profusely to him over the firing, which I guess for this scenario you can consider somewhat of a happy ending, but that about wraps up everything I have for this movie. Keep in mind, I didn't cover every little detail about the production of this movie, so I think it's definitely worth taking a deeper look into as well. And finally, that's going to wrap up the list for today. Although all of these movies seem terrible to work on, it is interesting to note that 4 of them are still well known and well talked about to this very day. There are definitely plenty more movies I could talk about, so let me know if you did want to see a part 2 or have any movies that I should look into myself. But besides that, I think that's everything I got. Thanks.